Coming here is one of the better things I've ever done. So when I sound crazy, or if the Israeli military should break with their racist tendency to not injure white people, please pin the reason squarely on the fact that I am in the midst of a genocide, which I am also indirectly supporting and for which my government is largely responsible.
If we were to go back in time a couple of years to when this campaign began, and someone would have predicted this outcome, I, for one, would have been totally shocked.
We just stuck our oar in the water without having any idea of what was going to happen.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the October 2015 Human Rights Commission Awards. You're all awarded for your time here tonight. Our general body meeting.
What Portland had done was develop a socially responsible investment committee of citizens that would help the city determine where to invest their dollars.
It was kind of handed to us how we would proceed because it had the 7 criteria that included human rights abuse, health impact of weapons production, environmental issues.
We formed a group called Occupation Free Portland to try to get the city council to divest from corporations that are very involved in Israel's occupation.
We felt it was important to go first to the Human Rights Commission because this is primarily a human rights issue.
And the first that we're going to look at, is the endorsed letter to Socially Responsible Investment Committee.
We had no idea when we started out what kind of response we were going to get from the Human Rights Commission, for example. And my feeling at the time was, if we can't win over the Human Rights Commission, then that's telling us that we have a long way to go.
So, this is time for discussion. The group has asked us to essentially sign on with the long list of folks who have endorsed.
The city council formed a do not buy list for city investments. They decided that they wanted to be socially responsible and have a way of screening companies based on various criteria.
The 7 criteria are human rights, monopoly domination, unfair labor practices, environmental violations, health violations, weapons production, and extreme tax avoidance.
So there are 4 companies that...
We had asked them to endorse our letter to put 4 corporations, Caterpillar, G4S, Hewlett-Packard, and Motorola Solutions, on the city's do not invest in list.
Whatever's easiest to invest.
The 4 companies we targeted were companies that have already been targeted for their behavior, and that includes G4S, which is involved in the prison system in Israel.
And they bring children here.
Hewlett-Packard supplies biometric equipment that's used in checkpoints.
It's a science known as biometrics, recognizing individuals based on their physical or behavioral characteristics.
The Palestinians have to go through these onerous checkpoints, which are really intended to just harass and curb their freedom of movement. Motorola supplies electronic surveillance equipment for the fences that Israel has established to encroach on Palestinian land and to protect its illegal settlements.
And then finally, Caterpillar, which has long been involved in providing military equipment to the Israeli military, which is used to destroy Palestinian homes and trees and infrastructure. And one of the moments that put Caterpillar on our focus was that the Caterpillar bulldozer was used to kill an young American woman, Rachel Corrie, who's from Olympia, Washington, as she was standing in front of a Palestinian home that was about to be demolished.
If you want to write your own letter, we do have a letter you could sign, or you could write your own. So the options really are yours.
They immediately jumped on the bandwagon.
Seconds. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Okay, so we will be adding our name to this letter.
Here to say thank you to all of you for your endorsement. I just went through the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and really every article you can see violations being committed by the Israeli occupation.
And I think, this endorsement, hopefully if we could bring it to the SRI and pass it, can begin to make sure that here in Portland we can be occupation-free.
That showed us that people do understand in the human rights community, and they were behind us.
We were thrilled to get their endorsement because they saw that, in fact, these companies not only are implicated in human rights violations, but they profit from them.
And that was a great victory there. And of course, it was one that once the word got out, the established Jewish community challenged big time.
Our opposition caught wind of this endorsement, and they went crazy. And they made threatening phone calls to the members of the Human Rights Commission.
There were a lot of threats directed at the members of the Human Rights Commission, including even threats of bodily harm, apparently were made in emails and phone calls.
They got a tremendous backlash from the Jewish Federation that this was inappropriate and not in their venue, and that they, didn't allow their Jewish voices, which was not true. There were Jewish voices involved in our campaign from the get-go, including Jewish Voice for Peace, and there were Jewish members of the commission.
And they got the mayor, and they got Congresswoman Bonamici, and they got the president of Portland State University, all to condemn the vote that the Human Rights Commission took. The two Jewish members of the commission decided to rescind their votes.
The chair of that commission was pressured to call a community meeting at which the Jewish Federation and their allies and we and our allies came and for 3 hours and 40 minutes presented testimony. It was a packed room of about 300 people.
Thank you for taking the time to engage in our public process and to share your feelings and perspectives as it relates to the HRC, its mission, and the recent decision made. Because we have been made aware of threats of bodily harm against others, I must implore all of those who are here today to please respect everyone who has chosen to show up so that this meeting can move forward, and those who have showed up are able to have their voices heard. We have heard that our decision on October 7th had an impact on portions of our community, and both a deep hurt and a lack of understanding on the HRC's choice to make this decision have been shared. At the same time, we have received hundreds of letters for support for that same action. We're going to move straight into item number 3, the director's report. Dante James.
Conversations about human rights are never comfortable. They're never easy. They're often divisive. It is passionate. I I've been a black man a long time, and so I know these conversations are passionate and personal to many of you in this room. And it's not a popularity contest, or in some places I might still be sitting on the back of the bus.
I'm named after someone who was killed in the Holocaust. Growing up, Israel was an enormous part of my life. And as I got more involved politically with issues and began to think about what it really meant to be a Zionist, to be pro-Israel, and to begin to understand that, in fact, there really were people, Palestinian people, who received the invoice for the Holocaust. At some point, one just really needs to live their values. And my values are all about justice and equality for all people and dignity for all people. And when I began to truly see the world that way, it then seemed like absolutely the most Jewish thing I could do was to support the Palestinian struggle.
When I went to Gaza as a nurse the first time, which was in 2011, I really understood the dire circumstances there. And then when Ned and I went back in 2014, it was even worse, just walking through the devastation. It's a moonscape. I think if you read it and you see it, you can't ignore it, that there is this huge injustice and feeling complicit. It's our tax dollars. And then, of course, being Jewish is another piece of it for me. Jewish values are justice and championing those who can't, who need us to be allies.
I went there in 2003, and then I went again in 2012. Went to a Bedouin village near the settlement of Mali Adumim in the West Bank, in an area that Israel is trying to cleanse of all Palestinians for their own purposes. And we saw a little school there that just breaks your heart, that the Bedouins had built out of mud and tires for their children. And the Israelis have, since I saw that school in 2012, they have demolished that school.
I understand that the Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and forcibly removed, and their villages were destroyed. For me, the epiphany was not so much, oh, now the veil has been taken from my eyes and I understand what's really going on, because I felt like I did understand what was going on. The real question for me was, why wasn't I doing anything about it?
I appreciate that. I'd like to give my comments before we get started.
Okay, so
And
I think it's sorry.
I would like to say that
Sam,
the audience.
Sam, we do have a process set in place. We've all just actually accepted the agenda
I
unanimously.
appreciate that.
And that agenda specifically requests that we adhere to it to ensure that we can get through
I understand
with
that.
this. And because you voted
were
to
able to
accept that
carry-
agenda, Sam, I would ask that you respect your vote to uphold to the agenda that we have, which I will make specific space for you. Bob, if you'd like to start off.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak before you and give voice to a perspective that was conspicuously missing on the matter of your support for a proposal to divest from or boycott several U.S. companies due to their operations in Israel. And this afternoon, we are urging you to rescind your endorsement of a letter to the city brought forward by the local Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, BDS Coalition, or euphemistically known as Occupation Free Portland. And I want to talk about this movement, the BDS movement, which cleverly conveys a message in human rights language, but their true goals, as demonstrated by their own leaders, are to delegitimize the state of Israel, vilify its supporters, and deny to the Jewish people the right to national self-determination. Their hatred, and I hate to use that word, their hatred for Israel, in fact, knows no bounds. Now this body, this commission, of course, is rightly concerned with combating bigotry and racism and homophobia and Islamophobia, and presumably also anti-Semitism. It is a one-sided, punitive action that singles out Israel. I don't know if any of you have been to Israel, but do you honestly believe that only one side of this conflict, the Palestinians, have suffered? Please do the courageous and the right thing and rescind your endorsement of this hurtful proposal. Thank you.
I would ask if it is possible that we continue to look at the issues as it relates to the 4 companies in particular.
I will get to the companies in a short moment, but I want to point out that the action was taken by the Human Rights Commission in a month that has been particularly very painful and difficult for the Israeli people.
And the Palestinians too.
I ask that everyone respect our invited testimony, please.
As you may know, over the last month and a half, there have been over 60 stabbings of people walking the streets in Israel. And there have been fire bombs thrown at cars and vehicles. Children have been burnt on most of their body. And during this month,
Please respect the person.
During this month
Some of them were stabbed by Israelis.
Here are the rules. Outbursts, any more outbursts, and I'll enforce the City of Portland rules of this building, and I will exclude you from this building for 24 hours.
Yes.
There will not be an argument. You'll be out this door. You can take it up right.
I'm sorry for that interruption, sir. Please continue.
Thank you. You took on an issue of divesting from companies that really, whether we call that human rights, that they are involved in human rights offenses or not, really depends on whether we take a position on that particular conflict. We are suffering too, and we have human rights as well. Thank you.
Is there a condemnation from this organization for the terror attacks and the murders of the Israeli citizens? Is there a condemnation of the incitement to violence? No. And what signal does this send? What message is communicated about the values and rights of the lives of Israeli citizens?
Some leaders within the movement propose indiscriminate policies that go beyond challenging Israeli actions to the very existence of Israel.
And there's nothing wrong with Jews having a country. What's wrong is the way that country came into being, that it came into being through the ethnic cleansing of the indigenous people and the continued subjugation of those people to maintain that ethnic privilege of Jewish citizens of Israel. That's the problem.
I mean, now we're in the 50th year of the occupation. Palestinians are still living in refugee camps because they've been denied their right of return. Palestinians within Israel still face more than 50 laws that discriminate against them.
We're here to hear about human rights issues as it relates to American companies. And so, Sam, I'll ask you first.
I want to apologize to everyone here and to the City of Portland. As a Human Rights Commissioner, I did not do my due diligence. I make no excuse, only an explanation. I did not attend the September meeting, and when we voted, I voted the conscience of the Commission without ever reading the material, without ever looking it over. I'm just being honest with you. Whether it looks good or not, that's the truth. It was only after I voted yes that members of Occupation Free got up and testified. And many of the comments and the words that they stated I found to be anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. And I renounced my vote on this divestment.
I did not understand last month at our vote what we were voting for. It was presented as a socially responsible investment action, and that sounded good to me, and I hadn't read the materials ahead of time either, and I voted without really thinking much about it.
To have been sent multiple emails with videotaped and transcripted information about the meeting that was held, regardless of if you were there, and then been asked to take the month, as we all do for every decision we make, to second a motion and then unanimously vote for the motion and then step away from the motion that you just seconded because of whatever pressure that you got is not taking your job seriously and is not a respectable place to be.
I wasn't pressured by the Jewish community or anybody else. And you can laugh or you can say whatever you want, but as a Jew, I'm saying that's how I feel. And for you to dismiss how I feel, I don't know what to say to that.
I take very seriously my job, and I take very seriously the idea that we need to do our homework and understand what we're voting on. We are volunteers, but we've been put in this position and been asked by the City of Portland to consider issues of human rights universally. This is not about Israel, it is not about Palestine, it is not about any particular country or religion. This is about human rights universally for all people.
As a Jew that sits on this commission, I'm offended and appalled and quite tired of people trying to say that this isn't about Israel, this isn't about Jews, that Jews and Israel aren't the same. For me personally, Israel and Jews are the same. So I'd ask my commission to stop doing that.
I'm Jewish and I'm not a Zionist. So
Good.
I'm going to again ask the community in the room to respect the time, just as we did earlier, to make sure that we can continue to hear from the commission, and then we will take public comment at that time.
I don't believe we really understand anything about the corporations that have been named in this action on either side. I don't think we know enough about it, and I don't think it's responsible for us to support something which is so divisive in our community.
I think it's unfortunate that the commissioner who said she didn't do her homework is now sitting here saying we don't have information.
It's not lost on me that the two commissioners that are continuing to be attacked have two things in common. One is we didn't do our homework, and two, we're both Jewish.
Come on.
I'm just stating the facts.
Israel is not the only place that these companies operate in. They operate all over the world, and they commit human atrocities everywhere. If we had said that, I think we could have avoided a lot of trouble.
When I saw that children are in detention centers as young as 9 years old, that is a human rights issue.
I'm Shoshone Bannock, Nez Perce in Yakima, and I serve here as a commissioner. These are my ancestral homelands. This country was taken from my ancestors through this kind of violation. And this profoundly affects all of us. A human rights violation across the world does affect folks here. It affects me when we talk about issues of indigenous rights, of homelands, of places we call home.
If you do have information again about the 4 companies, we are interested in hearing about that.
When Gaza was given over to the Muslims, the Palestinians, whoever lived there, they were given nurseries and cold frames and things to grow food and fruit and everything else. And what did they do? They destroyed it. They tore up all the buildings. They tore up all the infrastructure that the Jews had left. And the Jews had left money for them to be supported. They themselves brought it on themselves.
In 1948, Israel had reached out to its neighbors, had reached out to the Palestinians and said, please don't leave. Do not leave. This is your country as well as it is ours. This is the history that is not told.
How is it that the Palestinian state is not a multi-ethnic state, but Israel is? Very curious to me. I'd like you all to think about that.
I wonder why this this issue really started with Israel. Why didn't it start with China? Why didn't it start with Saudi Arabia? Why didn't it start with Iran and the American companies that are involved in really in non-democratic countries?
I'm offended by the actions of this committee and the way in which this divisive, discriminatory, and yes, it is anti-Semitic proposal.
Yes, it is.
It is. Please respect it.
I'm offended.
It troubles me when people of color are called racist in a atmosphere of addressing human rights issues. I would ask your two commissioners who didn't read their report to resign. Because it is my expectation, even though you're all volunteers, that you come to this body prepared to take action to protect the human rights of people who live, work, and worship in Portland.
The Jewish people are our sisters and brothers, and we do cry with them. But our Palestinian Muslims and Christians are also our sisters and brothers, and we cry with them because they are living under political and military oppression as a result of the Israeli occupation of their land and increasing numbers of illegal settlements. The Israeli government holds the power, and they're the only ones that can bring an end to this occupation.
The health ministry reported 74 Palestinians killed and injured since October 1st, including 17 kids. There were 89 attacks on journalists. Many of the Jews have been victims over hundreds of years, and especially in this last century. The great irony is they're doing similar things to these other people.
It's been 67 years since the Nakba, what Palestinians called when they were forced from their homes. In the past 24 years, 547,000 Israeli settlers are now in the West Bank in violation of international law and U.S. policy. There are 708 kilometers of apartheid wall that has been declared illegal by the International Court of Justice. 1,177 Palestinian homes were demolished just in 2014. And Gaza has been under siege for 8 years. The United Nations released a report just 1 month ago stating that in 5 years it will no longer be inhabitable because of that siege.
When corporations profit from misery, misery and injustice become the desirable feedstock for corporate profits. It really is simple. The city of Portland should not invest in corporations involved with human rights violations of Palestinians or of anyone. It is one step we can take here for making the world a decent place for everyone.
The Commission's decision is not an abstract statement regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It is focused on our city's financial support of global corporations which violate human rights. This is precisely what the HRC should be doing. This is not an attack on the Jewish community. At its heart, it is not an attack against Israel as much as an effort to make clear that peace between Israel and Palestinians will only happen if Israel acts consistently with principles of justice and equality, which are at the core of my religion and which are also at the core of international human rights.
Now, Israel, it turns out, is a racist state by 3 factors. By the functions that the government performs, the police and the Israeli Defense Forces, by the Knesset, by the laws they pass that take away the human rights, civil rights of Palestinians, and by the words of the elected leaders when they say, we want Israel to be a Jewish state. I mean, think about it. What is a Jewish state? That means if you're not Jewish, you're second class.
And when the history books are written about socially responsible investing, you all will stand proud on the right side of history. Thank you.
Does any other commissioner have anything else they would like to bring up as it relates to our October 7th vote?
I'd like to make a motion to overturn our decision to divest from the 4 companies.
I second that.
I don't believe we've been given information that justifies revoting on something that we already unanimously decided on based on information we were provided.
I didn't really see, other than very superficial kinds of like, oh, they tear down houses. I do know from the testimony that we had today that the organization that is sponsoring this has an agenda way above and beyond these 4 corporations and divesting in them. And I think that that's valuable for us to know.
But at this point, I'm not certain that I personally have heard of anything new as it relates to those 4 companies.
I haven't heard any new information from occupation-free. The information I have heard from the Jewish community and other people have changed my mind, and I'd like to vote to change my vote.
I don't want this organization to be going forward throughout the country and saying there was a unanimous vote in the by the Portland Human Rights Commission, because I think that would be an inaccuracy.
Thank you. So I do want to state that there was in fact a unanimous vote that took place on October 7th. I'm sitting in a hard place as it relates to making and taking a revote on something that all but 2 members of our commission said they did their work on and then showed up to the meeting in which to make a vote.
Can we already have that information? Can we stop going over that? I would just encourage you, Chair, to make a decision.
Sam, as the chair, you brought a motion, and so right now we're discussing that motion, the second, and then the objection to that motion.
Taking a vote is more sensitive to the people that participated in this process.
On the other hand, I would say that taking a revote without new information regarding the 4 companies that we voted were complicit in human rights violation, taking a new vote after we unanimously decided based on this information undermines all of our work.
All who are in favor of us revoting, please say aye.
Aye.
Or who vote no for the revote. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. The motion does not stand. We are not going to take a revote on our vote that happened.
My hat goes off to the members of the Human Rights Commission that after this very heated, very contested 3 hours and 40 minutes, it was a confrontation between 2 sides on this issue. They stood their ground.
They did not cave to the pressure. They stood up behind their decision, and they were such courageous and, noble people. I just have the greatest admiration for them.
Very brave stance given the level and degree of vitriol and opposition to the endorsement.
They passed it on to the Socially Responsible Investment Committee, who was hearing company by company, and the company that Portland is invested in, is Caterpillar.
The city has a portfolio of $1.7 billion, and in the last year they've invested more than $11 million in Caterpillar.
The next step along the way was the Socially Responsible Investment Committee.
And they were tasked with deciding which companies that Portland's invested in are really the worst of the worst, and we ought to get out of.
You're going to make your determination today on Wells Fargo and Walmart for your recommendation. And we're going to hear today some public input, focused public input on Caterpillar.
I strongly oppose the recommendation to add Caterpillar to the Portland Do Not Buy list because, in my view, it's hypocritical, anti-peace, and anti-Israel, and frankly anti-Semitic.
This past summer, my denomination voted overwhelmingly to divest from Caterpillar. We engaged to see if Caterpillar would change their behavior to no longer be involved in the violent behavior that happens toward Palestinians through this militarized machine, which really is a weapon.
Last June, the Oregon-Idaho Annual Conference of the United Methodist Church voted to divest from Caterpillar, in addition to 2 other companies, because of their human rights violations, specifically in the Palestinian territories.
Caterpillar is in violation actually of 5 of the 7 criteria that have been laid out. Environmental violations, health violations, unfair labor practices, extreme tax avoidance, and of course violations of human rights of the Palestinian people.
A lot of people here can talk more about the violence that's been done in the Palestinian territories by Caterpillar. A Caterpillar D9 bulldozer crushed my daughter Rachel to death in 2003. It was driven by the Israeli military. What I'd like to say is that Caterpillar has known how their machines have been used for decades. They're not responsible for how a customer uses their product after they sell it to them, but they're responsible for continuing to sell it knowing that's how it's used.
My daughter called for us all to make this stop. And I think one thing that we can do as a community is to refuse to be invested in a corporation that consistently fails to accept any responsibility for the human rights violations it knowingly supports. Thank you.
Last year, in 2014, Caterpillar bulldozers destroyed 18,000 homes in Gaza that have never been rebuilt. But it's also a city-destroying machine, because in the back of the bulldozer you can see there's a tremendously powerful hydraulic hook. So it goes into Palestinian cities, Gaza, Bethlehem, Nablus, Ramallah. It shoves the hook into the pavement. Imagine this in Portland. And it drives up and down the streets of Palestinian cities with this tremendously powerful machine, ripping out the sewage systems, the electrical lines, the telephone lines. The entire infrastructure is destroyed. So it would be inconceivable for me to see a city like Portland supporting a company whose job is, with a military, to destroy cities.
I think we're on the precipice of absurdity in putting this on the do not buy list.
Bribery and fraud have come up, tax evasion has come up, labor disputes have come up, and then obviously they've designed military weapons that have been used in very harmful ways.
You know, we have Rachel Corrie died 6 years ago yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And she didn't, you know, there's a weapon that killed her.
I think we have to differentiate our feeling about the company and the behavior, good or bad, of the Israeli government. And I find it difficult to find worst among the worst.
This company really does fall in the worst of the worst. The United Nations has a standard of ethics. This standard has been presented to Caterpillar with regard to the Israeli occupation, and they have paid it no heed.
Last month, you put correctly so Wells Fargo on that do not buy list because they're involved in private prison investment. On that basis of that one criteria, there was a unanimous agreement to put Wells Fargo on the do not buy list. And I certainly agree with that. You did the right thing. So I don't understand how a corporation that violates 5 of the 7 criteria can be exonerated.
The statement is recommend council put Caterpillar on the do not buy list. Raise of hands for yes.
I want to applaud the committee for a 4-2 vote. You are part of a new wave of cities looking at how to align our investments with our values.
Certainly that is up to you, and certainly we heard last meeting from Commissioner Novick that some sort of prioritization would be very helpful and is wanted.
We're sorry that at the last minute the process seemed to be a little skewed. We're worried that maybe a bias is introduced there.
Just in case the city council doesn't go for our full recommendations, we would like to make sure that they don't just randomly choose. Since Caterpillar was on a list from an international labor group for human rights from the 1990s, I want to make sure that people don't think, well, we're doing this because they're just selling them tractors. These are not just tractors.
Hard work.
You may not
financially impact a company by putting it on a list like this, but it is a moral statement.
One more time, we had a victory.
True, 2 people did not support the Caterpillar divestment, but really the momentum was with us.
In all of the hearings, when we went to the Human Rights Commission, when we went to the Socially Responsible Investment Committee, they could never counter any of the arguments we presented about actual human rights violations and violations of international law.
I think we're giving this city council sort of a moral challenge that if you have a human rights criteria and it can be demonstrated that these companies are violating human rights, do you stand firm with this criteria, or do you succumb to this pressure that, you know, you shouldn't look at human rights when Israel is involved?
It's at the bottom of my bag. None will proceed as planned. First item is going to be the consent agenda.
Okay. Why am I holding up this sign? Why am I saying that BDS is anti-Semitic? It is clearly documented in many records. Jews have lived in that land for thousands of years. It is our homeland. It is not the homeland of Arabs. Palestinians became known as Palestinians in 1967, not at the dawn of creation like Abbas Hamas says. Golda Meir said it best, as I paraphrase. When the Arabs love their children more than killing Jews, we'll have peace. And that is true. She said that in a true statement. Asshole.
And what happens in Gaza is terrible. Unfortunately, they elected in 2012 Hamas, an internationally recognized terrorist organization, to be their government.
If you have no idea what the BDS movement has done in the past, you would not want to pass on a resolution. They have created a situation that they actually shut down a factory with more than 500 employees are Palestinians. Not only because we're trying to pass on a resolution that is hatred, but because we're doing the exact opposite of what the majority of Israelis and Palestinians want, which is peace, not hatred.
My friends who are Palestinian, I adore them, and I think the occupation is difficult for both sides, and you have to understand that. And pushing us to this corner of doing things by the American way, but the way you think is right, is not fair and not appreciated in Israel and in Palestine.
The point is that PSU actually does not invest in any of these 4 companies, and most likely will not in the future. They have no connection to these companies, so why is this resolution even being brought forward?
Omar Barghouti came to campus and he's been quoted saying Israel does not have a right to exist and Jews should not be in the Middle East. Quote. So if that's not anti-Semitic, I really would like for you to tell me what is.
This proposed actions provoke deep divisions among students and has created an atmosphere of intolerance and hatred on this campus, something that is clearly evident in this room today.
The climate on this campus, more than anything this year, has been anti-Black and specifically anti-Islam. That has been rampant.
We want equal rights, and it's amazing to me how many people oppose the idea of Palestinians having equal rights.
The Israeli occupation of the West Bank is illegal. The separation wall Israel is building is illegal. The apartheid system that Palestinians are subjected to in their own historic homeland is a crime against humanity.
Israel has exploited the memory of the Holocaust in order to terrorize, massacre, and simply to make life miserable for millions of Palestinian people whose only crime is that they refuse to leave their land and their homes that they've lived on for centuries.
In the last war on Gaza, about 500,000 people has been displaced. Why? because their houses has been demolished. Why? Because companies like Caterpillar has been involved with the occupation.
So we're either on the side of Caterpillar, demolishing Palestinian homes and making a profit off of it, or we're on the side of justice. We're either on the side of G4S, imprisoning 300 Palestinian children right now against international law, or we're on the side of justice.
I've seen both sides of the justice system. There's the civil justice system that Israelis enjoy. There's the military justice system lacking in human rights and civil rights protections experienced by the Palestinians.
We're talking about demolition of homes, of families, of people who have been arrested for some crime. What would we do in this country if the home of a person was destroyed, the family home was destroyed, the neighboring homes destroyed because they were arrested? Are we talking about children in the middle of the night taken from their homes, thrown into a van, their parents not allowed to accompany them, detained for a month, and misused under detention, in fact threatened with death, threatened and tortured? I think there will not be real peace, real safety, real security for anyone in the area as long as half of the people are oppressing the other half of the people within that territory.
We're going to open up the floor for public comments.
So this resolution was on its way to passing last term, but the democratic process was halted by 3 complaints to the judicial board, 2 of which were withdrawn when they were shown to be without merit. We want to make sure that you know that there has been backroom efforts to prevent the democratic process on this resolution, and we want to make sure the same thing does not happen again.
And a lot of senators who have put a lot of time in this are very concerned about delays, and I definitely understand where that's coming from because in spring term, it didn't get passed.
This resolution is to show support for Palestinian suffering and to show opposition to human rights in this area, and we're focusing on this because it was brought to us by students.
This has been brought to us because of what is happening in Palestine and the egregious human rights violations.
All in favor of sending the resolution to exec committee with recommendations, please raise your hand. All right, the motion has been carried. The resolution is going to exec with recommendations. All right, thanks all. That was welcome. Thanks for coming, everyone. This is week 5. We're halfway through fall term.
There's biblical, archaeological, historical evidence, including from contemporaneous Greek and Roman writers at the time, demonstrating that Jews existed in that land and had a kingdom there in ancient times, throughout the Middle Ages, and even into the modern era before the 20th century.
If this resolution's goal is to bring about justice, then why is the founding of the only Jewish state in the world, an act of justice for the Jewish people, made a negative focal point in this resolution's text?
However, more to the point is a matter of intimidation that's been carried out on this campus. Members of the International Affairs Committee last spring who brought this resolution forward had their positions threatened, and the president of this campus, Wim Wewel, who's supposed to maintain neutrality on matters of student decisions, came out with a letter last spring deliberately lying about Super and its intentions. This is part of a national backlash against BDS. One of these backlashes is manifested by something called the Canary Mission, which targets students on campuses, calls future employers, calls their teachers, and tries to destroy their lives, smearing them as anti-Semites, when in fact they're protecting Palestinian rights.
I have watched from my own eyes D9 militarized bulldozers bulldoze Palestinian civilian homes. It's an extremely difficult thing to watch.
Challenging the oppressive policies of the State of Israel towards Palestinians and the corporations that profit off these violations is not anti-Semitism. The boycott movement is a nonviolent effort to show opposition to Israel's occupation of Palestine, similar to the movement of sanctions against South Africa, which showed opposition to apartheid. Safety for the Jews will never be won by supporting a state that oppresses Palestinian people, or any people, and it will never be won by supporting corporations which violate human rights and profit off of this oppression. As a Jew, Israel does not represent me, and I ask for PSU to divest from these corporations and to stand up for justice.
We refuse for our money to go to companies that build surveillance, that create checkpoints, that prohibit people's movement and contribute to human rights violation. I urge you to vote yes, please. Thank you so much, and thank you for your hard work.
Motion on the table is to approve the resolution to divest from companies involved in the Israeli military occupation. All those in favor, please raise your green card at this time. The resolution has passed.
Item 1333, accept September 2016 Socially Responsible Investments Committee report.
The committee is recommending the following companies be added to the City of Portland's Do Not Buy list: Walmart, Wells Fargo Bank, Caterpillar, the Bank of New York Mellon, HSBC Bank USA, JP Morgan Chase Bank, Amazon.com, Nestle Holdings, Credit Suisse, and Societe Generale, that is, if their eligibility is restored.
With regard to Caterpillar, the committee is recommending we put it in the Do Not Buy list essentially as a weapons manufacturer, thinking of bulldozers as weapons. And frankly, that Israel is the world's worst human rights violator. And I do have to tell you that in an era of rising anti-Semitism, I am concerned about making a suggestion that would play into that.
Despite the presence of a small fringe Jewish group on the opposite side of this issue, from the outset, from the time the Human Rights Commission considered this misguided proposal, our community, the mainstream Jewish community, has been unified in its opposition to the proposal.
On the far right and far left, there have been fringe groups that have been hiding under rocks for a long time that have now come up. This is supported and emboldening the fringe elements which are anti-Semitic.
Occupation Free Portland wants to co-opt the goodwill of the city council, just like they did it with my student government, to make a political statement about the existence of the state of Israel.
Why, oh why, would you adopt a proposal which accomplishes nothing positive, and yet it pits the Jewish community against the city of Portland itself through what we consider to be an anti-Israel, anti-Semitic proposition?
The BDS movement is inseparable from anti-Semitism, and as it's been pointed out, that its leaders are connected to it with their views.
Mr. Hornstein, I resent being called a fringe Jew. I applaud the deliberative process engaged in by the SRI committee, and I applaud you as a council for having initiated that process, and urge each of you to accept the committee's recommendations, particularly regarding Caterpillar and the banks.
As a Jew, I'm not surprised that a recent national survey found that 92% of rabbis believe investors have a moral obligation to avoid investments that harm society and are morally responsible for harm their investments cause.
I wholeheartedly support these 10 recommendations for the Do Not Buy list as an expression of Jewish values.
I don't mean to sound flip about this, but you folks are having to sit through over and over again a Jewish family argument. It's tragic for us. We have to understand what Israel has become and what we need to do about it. That's not what this is about. This is about Caterpillar. It's about a human rights situation like any other, and that's how you need to make your decision.
The Human Rights Commission faced the same divisive support and criticism in relation to our decision last year. The pressure put upon us to reverse our decision was immense and at times included threats and bullying. Today I'm here to assure you that the Human Rights Commission stands by its decision and in no way believes that placing Caterpillar on a Do Not Buy list is anti-Semitic or anti-Israel.
I lift up the 4,000 mentions of appreciation that came to us after our decision, and I want to say that anti-Semitism cannot and will not be tolerated. However, neither will human rights abuses.
And I'm really disappointed that we're hearing all this testimony, and even what you, Commissioner Novick, has said about our report. It makes me wonder if all the people that are questioning our report have even bothered to read our report.
No one here has really challenged whether these violations are happening. There's been two challenges. One is that other companies have violations. And I welcome the council men and women, as well as the people in the audience who are concerned about other companies, to do the organizing and bring those companies forward themselves, but not to cynically use that to stop this resolution against the violations of human rights of Palestinians, indigenous people here, workers, and our environment as well.
It's said that Caterpillar sells tractors to many countries, including the Palestinians. But the Palestinians' tractors are not used to destroy tens of thousands of Israeli homes. The Palestinian tractors are not used to tear up the streets of Israeli villages. The Palestinian tractors are not used to build a wall on Israeli territory that isolates Israeli villages. They're not used to destroy hundreds of Israeli villages, but the Israeli tractors are used for all of these human rights violations.
Military forces demolish wholesale, regardless of whether homes posed a specific threat, and most often in the absence of military necessity.
Sorry, Ms. Corey, your time is up.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Actually, I'd really like you to continue your testimony, please.
Thank you. Caterpillar D9R bulldozers were significant in these demolitions and have continued to be. These are militarized machines that Israeli military officials have said are a key weapon of the occupation.
The other thing I want to say goes to you, Commissioner Novick. I commend you for the idea of starting this conversation. When you said, however, that you didn't think that that a corporation could be responsible for what somebody does after they buy their products, I want to react to that because I agree with you. When our daughter was killed, I thought that's not the fault of Caterpillar. You know, they sold the bulldozers. And then I found out that they had for years been on notice for how the bulldozers were used in human rights violations. They are responsible. And if you invest in them, then you take on that responsibility yourself if you profit from that.
The City of Portland cannot invest in companies who deny futures to people who live under military occupation.
We will not profit from human rights abuses. The church said that. Unitarian Universalists said it. United Church of Christ said it. The Quakers said it. It's time now for Portland to say it. We've got your back. Do the right thing.
We don't want to disempower the very committees that we establish.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been told that putting Caterpillar on the do not buy list is divisive, controversial, and so on. Doing the right thing is always controversial before it becomes normal. That was the case with ending slavery, ending Jim Crow, achieving women's suffrage, LGBTQ rights, and every other democratic advance in this country. We as American citizens have a right and a duty to express our opinion about what Israel does with our money, including the purchase of weaponized Caterpillar equipment. You've been told that the entire mainstream Jewish community is opposed to putting Caterpillar on the do not buy list. There is no mainstream Jewish community. The majority of American Jews aren't affiliated with any of the organizations like the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland that claim to speak for them. The policies of those institutions are undemocratically influenced by their biggest donors, many of whom hold political views far to the right of the majority of the American Jewish community.
I am not a religious man, but I am Jewish. It's the one cultural identity I have. So I feel torn in two different directions. On the one hand, I share the concern about doing anything that could contribute to anti-Semitism. On the other hand, I share the desire of folks in Jewish Voice for Peace to make Israel a better country. And frankly, I was rather disturbed to hear them referred to as, quote, fringe Jews a couple of weeks ago. Given the strong public sentiment to consider Wells Fargo and Caterpillar, I decided today, for purposes of discussion, that I would offer an amendment to my own proposal to add Wells Fargo and Caterpillar to the do not buy list.
What I'm going to offer is a friendly amendment. We didn't used to buy any corporate securities before 2009. And I don't see why we should buy them now.
There was an amendment offered by Commissioner Novick to add 2 companies to the list. How is this amendment that Commissioner Fritz offered related to it?
This overrides.
I'm saying this
overrides it?
yes, that we would not invest in any corporate debts until we come back with a formal policy. I think this is such a momentous decision that in the new year, Mayor Wheeler and Commissioner Udaley are going to be wanting to be part of it.
People are looking for hope. They're looking for inspiration from cities like Portland. This is the most critical time for us to make a clear statement in putting at least or adding at least Wells Fargo and Caterpillar to our do not buy list.
We should be clear and go ahead and just add Wells Fargo and Caterpillar to the 2017 do not buy list. Let's not redo work that has already been done. What you set in motion is powerful and visionary, but it's not worth the paper it's written on if you don't implement it.
You've won, that we are not going to invest in the companies that you don't like. We want to invest only in things that we are absolutely sure are okay, and that for right now is government bonds and treasury securities. I don't understand why you think this is disrespectful. We've said yes, we're not going to buy these companies.
Saying we're not going to buy any companies is very different than singling out those that are the worst of the worst. There is a financial aspect, but there is also a symbolic and political aspect by basically not doing anything and just putting it on ice. It does not accomplish anything. So I'm sorry, but I find this extremely disappointing.
Conceivably, this vote could have been taken some time ago. And with each of those delays, I think we and you have missed an opportunity to make a strong moral statement about corporate culture, to not vote in any corporations in a sense as to equalize them and just not acknowledge the distinction between corporations with ethical corporate culture and the worst of the worst, the bad actors.
We're doing away with the list, and then we are
Not buying any
corporate securities until we just make a decision in April.
Correct.
Correct.
For now.
For now.
With
For now,
the-
yeah,
with
for
this-
Aye.
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 Well,
We
yes.
are adjourned for 2016.
Good afternoon. We are the Raging Grannies.
Wells Fargo and Caterpillar bring us death and shame. They bulldoze and they terrorize, all in money's name. Which side are you on? Which side are you on? The people or the profiteers? Which side are you on?
Thank you, Raging Grannies. And now we've got musical interludes. I feel like we're getting the whole deal here. Thank you. Carla, please call the item for this afternoon.
Item 340, adopt City of Portland investment policy.
Jennifer Cooperman, City Treasurer, thank you. The City Council previously had asked you to come back with your best shot at a policy.
Council direction last December was to suspend direct investments in corporate securities and to propose amendments to the city's investment policy that would incorporate environmental, social, governance considerations. MSCI ESG research was selected because its methodology is comprehensive, thorough, consistent, and because its research most closely aligned with a list of 7 social and value concerns that Council established in 2014. The city pays $37,500 a year to have access to this research, and we've agreed in our contract not to disseminate it to other parties.
I'm concerned about the proprietary and
secret nature of this information and the lack of transparency to the public.
We would be reading the investment reports that we are paying for and use that as part of our analysis and decision-making.
Which is not available to the public.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. I want to honor the efforts of our Socially Responsible Investment Committee, and I want to preserve the council's ability to add or remove companies from its do not buy list in the future. MSCI is more about risk management than it is about our shared values and ethics.
The Portland community will not delegate our trust to Wall Street and a Wall Street firm which works in secret. You have been elected to make these decisions and to do so in the open. We know when we are being told to mind our own business, and this indeed is our business.
To abdicate its duties to make investment choices based on social principles to a Wall Street company rather than utilize the thorough, dedicated work of the Socially Responsible Investment Committee is lazy and irresponsible.
I strongly urge you to keep the committee active. These citizen volunteers worked diligently for a year, doing a thorough and excellent job.
You are infinitely better served by the advice you have heard from your constituents in these hearings than you will ever be by the institution recommended by our city's treasurer.
The proposed policy does not allow for citizen input into how their money is invested. It does not even allow for city council input. It passes total control of investments to MSCI ESG, a Wall Street firm that essentially ignores the environmental and human values that are deeply held by the people of Portland.
This acronym kept being referred to, MSCI. This is Morgan Stanley Capitalist Investment International. And this is completely anti-democratic. It completely removes any type of transparency in this process.
If the past SRI committee was not satisfactory, make adjustments. But this policy is going 100% in the opposite direction.
We're told that this resolution stems from a desire to end a contentious and divisive process. We would ask, has democracy ever not been contentious? Have human rights ever not been divisive?
And from the very beginning in our discussions with the city about Caterpillar, I've heard statements like this: nothing we do will have any impact on Caterpillar. But the facts tell a different story. What you see here is a list of companies that have ceased, partially or completely, investing in the military occupation of Palestine. Portland has the opportunity today to be a significant voice in a struggle that will inevitably succeed. Please do the right thing.
We were one of the first cities to have a socially responsible investment policy, and now other cities are following our lead. Some, for example, divesting from companies that even so much as bid on construction of the wall with Mexico. Support human rights from Standing Rock to Palestine. That would be the moral thing to do and an inspiration to cities around the world.
I'm one of the people that have spent hours and hours researching, reading, just stacks in my garage. I have stacks of these MSCI reports. By following our report, you would have more options to invest in companies to get the returns until we find a viable option. What's really important is naming these companies. In terms of financial impact, we're talking about a very small financial impact, but these companies all invest millions of dollars for their corporate image, PR, and that's what matters.
I know how much time and energy you've put into this, and I do applaud it and I do respect it, but really, it's not divestment that changes a company's behavior, it's the bottom line.
I'm angry. If we keep supporting this, we are supporting the worst crap in the world, and we can't keep doing it. We only put 9 on the list. That's incredible. Unbelievable that you guys didn't adopt the report, the full report. Unbelievable to me. I cannot believe that I've read all of that stuff, and you are choosing to put our tax money into all of those corporations. It's appalling. So stand up and do the right thing today, right now.
I want to acknowledge what Katrina Scotto DiCarlo said. I did ask her to serve, and she's one of my heroes. My guess is you may be slightly disappointed with me today, but I hope you don't feel like I've disrespected your work, because my thinking has grown enormously through this process.
Thank you, everybody, for your testimony. We appreciate it.
We received dozens of emails and phone calls from constituents, and I believe we had one that was against adopting SRIC proposals. So I do feel that the prevailing sentiment throughout the community is that the public wants us to put our money where our mouth is. I'd like to amend Section 3, Item F, by adding Caterpillar to the Do Not Buy list as recommended by the Socially Responsible Investment Committee in their September 20th, 2016 report. Due to proprietary information, I'm not allowed to say why Wells Fargo was not included as an amendment, and I think it's an example of why this is not good public policy. And I do want to add that I fully support divesting from Wells Fargo. So.
And I really want to hear follow-up from Commissioner Udaley about exactly why you can't speak to why Wells Fargo is not included. That is offensive.
My objective here would probably be to move us towards the perfect world of having no disputes or no debates about the ESG principles in which we're investing. For every corporate issuance, I can find you somebody who's offended by it.
The amendment I'll put on the table is that we would eliminate from our investment policy commercial paper and corporate bonds altogether.
That part of what we were trying to do in this instance was to do some public shaming and have some specific companies called out. So if that's still the desire, I would respectfully suggest that just not investing in any corporate securities doesn't get there.
I'm still of the view, if there's a consensus on the council, that we should get out of the business of corporate securities. I don't want to be the arbiter of that on a regular basis.
I think it's the wiser course to get out of the business altogether, because I don't really want to have to do this once or twice a year and have the same discussion. I've spent 4 hours today. We'll spend 4 probably by the time we're through. Probably 10 to 12 hours in December, another 4 or 5 hours last September too. And, there's a lot of issues that I'm not getting work done on today.
The Raging Grannies sang, which side are you on, human rights or profits? We've just heard that going with Commissioner Saltzman's amendment would take $3.5 million from the city's budget.
Why don't we take a vote on Saltzman 1, and Commissioner, could you restate it again for the record, just so we're all very clear?
Yes, it would basically say that we will no longer invest in corporate securities.
Fish.
I want to get out of the business of picking and choosing. Aye.
Udaley.
I would be comfortable supporting Commissioner Saltzman's amendment. I also would have been happy to adopt the full recommendations of the SRIC. Aye.
Fritz.
I'm very worried about losing $3.5 million in a budget process that we're currently in. That will mean more cuts in places that will hurt. No.
Wheeler.
No, so the amendment passes. So to the main motion, please call the roll as amended.
Fish.
My vote is aye.
Saltzman.
Aye.
Udaley.
Aye.
Fritz.
Aye.
Wheeler.
I will cast a friendly aye vote for the ordinance as amended, since it's passed anyway. Aye. The ordinance is adopted.
Thank you, everyone.
It was a partial victory, but it was not what we really hoped for when we set out.
So it seems to me that the city was looking for a way out.
The best victory would have been maintain the SRI policy.
We wanted a clear statement that they were going to put Caterpillar on the do not buy list because of its violations of Palestinian human rights.
The disappointment is a chance to really call out the companies and let the world know why we're not investing. By just blanket not investing in any doesn't give us the chance to do that.
Getting out of all corporate securities was kind of a cop-out on the part of the City Council.
I mean, there was a half a day of testimony, a lot about the injustices in Palestine at the City Hall, on the City Council's agenda, and so many people heard about it. So I think this way surpassed, where it's pretty amazing, actually.
When you think back to the November hearing where we filled the chamber and people even spilled into overflow rooms, that was a remarkable moment just for the fact that so many people from the community took up the issue of Palestinian human rights and brought it to the City Council. And they listened, they had to listen.
When we bring the issues of human rights violations and corporate responsibility before citizen groups like the Human Rights Commission, like the Social Responsible Investment Committee, we can win hands down every time.
So we showed that we did have widespread community support. We were just not fringe people, we were just not extremists.
And so that's the interesting thing about this kind of political work. There are unanticipated good outcomes sometimes. And on the other hand, there are opportunities to build alliances. And so I think the work just continues.